Mom, can we skip the good old days this time? We have guests, and they'll be bored hearing about things they don't know. The words from my son, Daniel, weren't loud. They were spoken quietly, almost a whisper, yet they cut through the hum of the Saturday dinner party with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I froze, my hand stopping midway to my lips with a wine glass. Something inside me fractured a connection as thin as a spider's thread, one I had spent a lifetime weaving from memory and love. It happened at our large oak table, in the house where every scratch on the floor had its own story. Daniel, my pride, sat opposite me, next to his wife, Kate, who shot me a quick, pitying yet annoyed glance. I was just about to tell the story of how my late husband had comically proposed to me by dropping the ring into apple pie dough, but the story died before it was born. A thick, awkward silence fell, one the guests tried to puncture with nervous coughs. I slowly set down my glass, looked directly into my son's eyes, and said quietly but clearly, "You're right. Some stories are not for all ears." And I fell silent. For the rest of the evening, I uttered no more words than the necessary please and enjoy. I moved on autopilot, like a well-rehearsed mechanism. Here I was, getting up to bring out that very apple pie, the aroma of cinnamon and baked apples filling the room, but for me, it had no scent. I heard their laughter, which had returned, a little forced at first, but growing louder, while in my own ears there was only a low, vibrating hum. I cut the pie into even slices, my hands performing the familiar task, while my soul watched from a distance. Every movement was measured, every glance was calm. The external stoicism I had cultivated during my years as a teacher had become my armor. They saw a gracious hostess, a 9-year-old widow who was just a little tired. They didn't see the library inside me crumbling to dust. The worst part was the word boring. My life, my love, my joys and sorrows, all of it was simply boring. When the door closed behind the last of the guests and the sound of Daniel's car faded into the night, I remained standing in the middle of the living room. The air was heavy with the smell of foreign perfumes and leftover festive food. Instead of starting to clean up, as I had done 1,000 times before, I did something different. I walked to the china cabinet, opened its doors, took out a single crystal teacup I saved for special occasions, and brewed myself a cup of tea. 1 tea bag, 1 cup. Not for the family, not for guests, not for us, just for me. I sat in my old rocking chair, my grandfather's favorite, and watched as my face was reflected in the dark window, the empty room behind it. This silence was different. It was no longer cozy. It was deafening. The warmth of the cup in my palms did not warm me. It only highlighted the internal chill spreading through my veins. And then they came the memories, no longer as warm friends, but as evidence in a courtroom. I remembered 2016. The old film reels in their boxes had begun to degrade, the photographs to yellow. I felt a panic, a fear of the physical loss of our history. I spent almost $3,000, all the money I had saved, for a dream trip to Italy to see Florence, to digitize every film, every snapshot. I sat in a small studio, watching the faces of my parents, young and in love, flash across a screen, followed by Daniel's first steps, his funny expression in a school play. When I proudly showed my son the digital archive on a new hard drive, he just nodded absently. "Good, Mom, just don't lose the password." To him, it was just a file. To me, it was a life I had saved. Then, my diaries appeared before my eyes. 50 years' worth, stacks of filled notebooks in the closet. I remembered writing down my son's first words, transcribing my husband's funny anecdotes, documenting every significant event so that nothing would be lost, nothing erased from the family memory. I did it at night, by lamplight, when everyone else was asleep. I was the chronicler, the archivist, the keeper. I truly believed that a person lives as long as the memory of them lives, and I was building immortality for my descendants. And today, I was told my books were of no interest to anyone. In that moment, I finally understood that to them, I wasn't a living person with memories, but an old record that everyone had already heard and grown tired of. I wasn't family. I was a resource, a function that was no longer needed. Done with thinking, I began to act. Slowly, methodically, as if performing a long prescribed ritual. I went upstairs to my husband's study, and from the bottom drawer of his desk, I retrieved a heavy wooden box. Inside, in folders yellowed with age, were the documents. Here was the deed to this house, signed by my own father. Here was my husband's will, naming me as the sole inheritor. Here was the land grant. I laid them out on the desk. These were not just papers. They were proof of my sovereignty. This was my instrument of self-defense. I picked up the phone. My fingers did not tremble. I found the number saved under Mr. Peterson, lawyer, and pressed call. Hello, Mr. Peterson? This is Nora. I apologize for the late call. I'd like to make an appointment to amend my will. Yes, substantial changes regarding the primary asset. The conversation was brief, businesslike. After hanging up, I felt an invisible weight lift from my shoulders. Then, I walked to the living room wall, where a large family portrait, taken 5 years ago, was hanging. Me, Daniel, Kate, the grandchildren, all smiling. I carefully took it down. The heavy frame left a pale rectangle on the wallpaper, the ghost of a past that would no longer be. I didn't shatter it. I simply leaned it against the wall, facing inward. That night, I sat in my grandfather's rocking chair, staring into the darkness outside the window. The silence in the house no longer oppressed me. It had become my ally, a space for a new plan. I realized I hadn't lost my family. I had simply said goodbye to the version of my family that only ever existed in my memory. He asked me to be silent. I, however, decided to make my stories speak forever. The air in Mr. Peterson's office smelled of old leather and paper, a scent of stability that settled in my lungs. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in its beams, each a tiny, silent witness. This was a place of quiet certainties, a world away from the emotional wreckage of my dining room. My heart did not pound. My hands, resting on the smooth mahogany of the desk, were perfectly still. Mr. Peterson, a man whose kindness was as meticulously tailored as his suits, looked at me over his spectacles. Nora, he began gently, you said on the phone you wished to make substantial changes to your will. I met his gaze, my voice steady and clear, devoid of the tremor I had feared. I do, I said. I want to change it completely. I intend to bequeath my house, its contents, and the surrounding property, not to my son, but to the County Historical Society. He blinked, the only sign of his surprise. I see. And your reasons? I offered a small, sad smile. Let's just say I've decided to invest my legacy where it will be appreciated. I want to establish a charitable trust, an endowment fund to maintain the property as a center for oral history. My memories, my archives, they are intangible assets. It is time they were properly protected. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of repair. The next morning I began the physical work. My garden, neglected during the last few weeks of emotional turmoil, was calling to me. I spent hours on my knees, the damp earth cool against my skin, methodically pulling weeds. Each stubborn root I wrenched from the soil felt like a small victory, a reclaiming of my territory. I wasn't just clearing the flower beds, I was clearing my mind, making space for new growth. The sun warmed my back, and the rhythmic work of my hands, weeding, pruning, watering, soothed the last vestiges of the previous night's ache. A neighbor, Mrs. Gable, called over the fence, "Your roses are looking lovely this year, Nora." I smiled back, a genuine smile this time. "Thank you, Helen. It just took a bit of tidying up. Our short, pleasant chat about the weather and her new grandchild was a balm. It reminded me that I was not isolating myself from the world, only from the parts of it that sought to diminish me. My next stop was the bank, a place of cold marble floors and polite, impersonal transactions. The young woman behind the counter was efficient. "How can I help you, Mrs. Allen?" she asked with a practiced smile. "I'd like to close a joint savings account and remove secondary access from my primary checking account," I stated, sliding my ID across the counter. As she typed, the name Daniel M. Allen appeared on her screen. For a fleeting second, the procedural coldness was pierced by a memory, sharp and vivid as a shard of glass. Daniel, age 7, standing on his tiptoes at this very counter, his small, chubby hand clutching a crisp $5 bill he'd earned for raking leaves. The pride in his eyes as he made his first deposit. "I'm a saver, Mom," he had declared. The memory didn't bring tears. It brought a quiet, profound sadness for the boy who had understood the value of things, a boy who had vanished long before the man sitting at my dinner table had asked me to be silent. The teller's voice pulled me back. "All set, Mrs. Allen." "Access has been revoked." I nodded, signed the required forms, and walked out into the bright afternoon, feeling not lighter, but more solid. Later that week, following a sign I'd seen in the local paper, I visited the County Historical Archive, housed in the basement of the old courthouse. The air was cool and smelled of history itself. A young woman named Elena, a graduate student with bright, curious eyes, showed me around. When I mentioned I had diaries spanning 50 years and a newly digitized collection of home movies from the 1952nd, her professional politeness transformed into genuine excitement. "Mrs. Allen, that's incredible. That's not just family history, that's a social record. Do you know how rare it is to find such a complete, personal archive? We talked for over an hour." I told her the story of my husband's proposal, the one Daniel had silenced. Elena laughed, captivated. "That's a treasure," she said. "A real treasure." For the first time, I felt seen not as a relic, but as a resource. She was the new audience I had been searching for without even knowing it. The phone at home had started to blink with an insistent red light. I had let the calls go to the answering machine. One evening, while preparing a simple dinner for one, I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the quiet kitchen, laced with a frustration he was trying to disguise as concern. "Mom, it's me. Again. We're getting worried. You're not answering your phone. You didn't call on Sunday. This isn't like you. Just call me back, okay? Let me know you're all right." I listened, dispassionately analyzing his words. He wasn't worried. He was unsettled. A routine had been broken. A resource was no longer responding as expected. His comfort, his convenience, had been disrupted. The silence he had demanded was now unnerving to him because it was a silence I controlled. I deleted the message without a flicker of emotion. The final procedural step was the simplest. The next day, a locksmith came and changed the locks on all my doors. The solid, definitive click of the new key turning in the lock was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. That evening, I undertook my final repairs. I took down the remaining family photos from the walls and mantelpiece. I didn't burn them. That felt too theatrical, too angry. Instead, I carefully placed them, along with Daniel's birth certificate and his childhood report cards, into an archival box. Using my best cursive, I wrote on the label, Family Archives, the Daniel branch. I was not erasing my past. I was curating it, placing it in its proper context. Then I took out my old, leather-bound address book. I found his entry, written years ago in ink that had slightly faded. I picked up a pen and drew a single, neat, straight line through his name and address. A redaction, not a furious scribble. It was done. My final act was for the future. On my way back from the lawyer's office, I had bought a small, high-quality digital voice recorder for $150. I unboxed it now, the cool metal feeling solid and purposeful in my hand. I pressed the record button. "My name is Nora Allen," I began, my voice clear and strong in the quiet room. "And this story begins with an apple pie. On Saturday, exactly 1 week after that final family dinner, I walked downtown. The sun was warm, and the city felt alive around me. I stopped in front of a small French patisserie I hadn't visited in years, a place my husband and I used to love. Through the window, I saw rows of perfect, glistening eclairs, delicate fruit tarts, and flaky croissants. I went inside, bought myself a single perfect chocolate eclair, and walked to a bench in the nearby park. As I took the first bite, the rich dark chocolate and smooth cream filling the senses, I felt a profound sense of peace. For the first time in a very long time, the silence was not empty. It was full. It was mine. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the sharp, insistent rapping began at the front door. I was in the living room, seated in my grandfather's rocking chair, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know it was Daniel. The rhythm of the knocking was his impatient, entitled, a demand disguised as a request. It was followed by the buzz of the doorbell, pressed and held down. Through the thick oak door, I could hear his muffled voice. "Mom? Mom? I know you're in there. What is going on? Why won't you answer my calls? Why is the key not working?" I took a slow sip of my tea. The delicate floral scent filled my senses. He rattled the doorknob, a futile, metallic sound of frustration. I remained perfectly still, the gentle creak of my rocking chair the only sound in the house. His voice rose slightly, laced with an irritation that was quickly eclipsing his feigned concern. "Mom, this is ridiculous. Open the door." I closed my eyes, remembering a phrase my own mother used to say, "If they won't listen to a whisper, they'll hear the silence much louder." He knocked one last time, a hard, angry thud, before his footsteps retreated down the path. The silence he left behind was profound. It wasn't a void. It was a presence. It was the sound of my own sovereignty. With the house once again settled in tranquility, I stood up and began a slow, deliberate walk through my own palace of memory. This wasn't a mournful pilgrimage. It was a final inventory. I started in what had been Daniel's childhood bedroom. I ran my hand over the series of notches carved into the doorframe, marking his growth from a small boy into a towering teenager. A warm memory surfaced. Daniel at age 8, standing proudly against the wood, his hair still damp from the bath, while his father carefully penciled a new line just above his head. His laughter, pure and unburdened, seemed to echo faintly in the still air. But then, a colder memory superimposed itself. Daniel, home from college for the holidays, standing in this same doorway. I had just finished telling him a story about his grandfather. "Mom," he had said, not unkindly, but with a weary sigh, "does everything have to be a history lesson?" The words casual then, were a harbinger of the dinner that had broken me. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the scent of a chapter that was definitively closed. My journey continued to the kitchen, the heart of the home. I stopped at the large butcher block table, its surface a map of nicks and scratches, each a tiny scar of a shared life. I saw it laden with birthday cakes, Thanksgiving turkeys, and stacks of homework. I remembered the warmth of Sunday mornings, the smell of pancakes, the sound of my husband reading the paper aloud while Daniel drew pictures with crayons. But then, the image shifted. I saw the table on the night of the dinner party, laden with food no one truly appreciated. I saw Daniel's face, his expression a mask of social anxiety as I began my story. I saw Kate's quick, dismissive glance. The memory of their laughter after I fell silent was like the ghost of a sound, hollow and mocking. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and nourishment, now felt like a stage set for a play whose run had ended. Finally, I returned to the living room and stood before the bookshelves that lined the walls. My books were my oldest friends. I pulled out a worn copy of 100 Years of Solitude, its spine softened from countless readings. I remembered reading it aloud to my husband on long winter evenings, the magic of the words weaving a world around us, but my eyes fell on a small, empty space on a lower shelf. That was where the box containing the digitized family archives had sat for years, untouched. A cold memory washed over me. A few Christmases ago, I had excitedly set up the projector to show the old home movies. Daniel and Kate had endured it for 10 minutes before making excuses about needing to check their phones for an important work email. The small screen had flickered in the dark room, playing to an audience of one. It was then I realized I was not sharing memories. I was imposing them. I was the curator of a museum no one wanted to visit. After my tour was complete, I sat back down at the kitchen table. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. This was not a house of ghosts. It was simply a house full of things. Things I had loved, things I had used, and things that now belonged to another life. I took out a fresh notebook and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote, "To keep." The list was surprisingly short. My diaries, the box of old photographs and letters, my grandfather's rocking chair, my collection of first edition novels, a few favorite kitchen items. Then I turned to a new page and wrote, "To leave." The list was much longer. The furniture, the china, the linens. The house and its contents were for the Historical Society. They would know what to do with them. They would honor the stories held within these walls. This act of list-making was not about loss. It was about choice. I was choosing what parts of my past had the right to be in my future. The next day, the packing began. It was a slow, methodical process, a quiet ritual. I didn't throw things into boxes. I treated each chosen item with a reverence born of long acquaintance. I wrapped each of my 50 diaries in soft, acid-free tissue paper, their brittle pages holding the ink of my life. I placed them one by one into a sturdy archival box. Then came the most important symbol of my new life, my new digital voice recorder, and the dozen audio cassettes on which I had already begun to narrate my archives. I placed the recorder in its original box, nestled in its protective foam, and laid it on top of the diaries. This small, metallic object was not a thing of the past. It was the engine of my future. It was my voice, finally untethered from an unwilling audience. I took a black marker and wrote on the side of the box in clear, firm script. It didn't say memories or Nora's things. It said simply, the work. When the last box was taped shut, I stood in the middle of the living room and surveyed the space. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the clean, uncluttered surfaces. The house no longer felt empty. It felt clear, ready for the new stories that would be told here, stories that would now be written without me. The days that followed the packing were filled with a quiet, productive energy. I was no longer dismantling a life, I was building one. I spent a morning on the phone with a real estate agent, inquiring about a small, sunny apartment downtown, one with a balcony perfect for a pot of lavender. The agent's cheerful voice, describing closet space and natural light, sounded like a promise. Later, I sat on my front porch, not waiting for a car to pull into the driveway, but simply feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. The world seemed different when you weren't constantly anticipating someone else's arrival. My grief for Daniel had also changed. It was no longer a sharp, open wound, but a dull, distant ache. I realized I didn't miss the man who sat at my table, impatient and dismissive. I missed the idea of him, the bright, laughing boy in the doorframe, the enthusiastic child clutching his first $5 bill. I was mourning a memory, not a person. And you can't build a future with a ghost. The unexpected call came on a Thursday morning while I was carefully wiping dust from the leaves of my favorite fiddle leaf fig. The number was unfamiliar, so I let it ring, expecting another automated sales pitch, but they called back immediately. On the third ring, a cautious curiosity won over, and I answered, "Hello?" A young, hesitant voice on the other end said, "Grandma, it's Leo, my grandson, Daniel's eldest." He was 17, a quiet, observant boy who usually hovered at the edge of family gatherings. "Leo," I said, my voice even, "is everything all right?" There was a long pause, filled with the static of his uncertainty. I'm sorry," he finally stammered. The words hung in the air, fragile and tentative. I didn't rush to fill the silence, to absolve him with a quick, "It's okay." Instead, I held my ground, gently but firmly. "For what exactly are you sorry, Leo?" The question wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to be specific, to prove he understood. I could hear him take a shaky breath. "For that night," he said, his voice clearer now. "For sitting there and saying nothing when he said that to you, it was wrong." I knew it was wrong, but I didn't say anything. In that moment, his apology became real. He wasn't just sorry I was hurt. He was sorry for his own inaction. "I see," I said, my voice softening. "Thank you for telling me that." Another pause. "Then can I see you? Please? Just me." This was the test. Not a demand for a family summit, not a plea on his father's behalf, but a simple, personal request. "All right, Leo." I agreed. "Come tomorrow afternoon, at 2, and yes, just you." The meeting took place not in the formal living room, but at the small table in my bright, sunny kitchen. The air was still and quiet, punctuated only by the steady ticking of the old wall clock. I poured him a glass of lemonade and set a plate of simple shortbread cookies between us, the same kind I used to bake when he was a little boy. He sat awkwardly, his long limbs looking out of place on the small wooden chair, his eyes fixed on the table. "I didn't know what to do," he began, finally looking up at me. "Dad gets like that sometimes. He wants everything to be perfect, modern. He thinks your stories are old-fashioned." He stumbled over the word, as if it tasted foul. I listened without judgment, letting him find his own way through the explanation. "I guess I just go along with it," he confessed, his gaze dropping again. "It's easier." I reached across the table and placed my hand gently over his. "You just wanted to belong, Leo," I said, not as a grandmother, but as one person to another. It's a powerful need, but belonging shouldn't cost you your own voice. He looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time, I saw not just my son's child, but a young man grappling with his own integrity. We sat in silence for a while, the ticking of the clock a steady heartbeat in the quiet room. "I miss your stories," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I liked hearing about Grandpa and the pie." He picked up a cookie and took a small bite. Can I come back? Sometime?" This was the crux of it all. The moment where the old door could either slam shut or be reopened on new terms. "Yes, Leo," I said. "You can. But not for the cookies. And not because it's what you're supposed to do. You can come back when you want to have an honest conversation. When you want to listen. And when you want to share a story of your own. That is the only price of admission now." When he left an hour later, I wrapped 3 shortbread cookies in a napkin and handed them to him at the door. It wasn't a peace offering to the family. It was a small, simple transaction between 2 people who had just agreed on the terms of a new, more honest relationship. As I watched his car pull away, I stood in the doorway, feeling the cool afternoon breeze. A family isn't a fortress with impenetrable walls, I realized. It's more like an old house. Sometimes, a foundation cracks under pressure. You can't ignore it, and you can't just paper over it. You have to repair it, carefully, brick by brick. Maybe some doors don't need to be bolted shut forever. Perhaps they just need to be quietly locked from the inside, leaving a window slightly ajar for the ones who learn to knock gently and who are willing to enter alone. The day I signed the lease was the first day of autumn. A cool, crisp breeze rustled the city trees, carrying the scent of distant rain and new beginnings. For the occasion, I chose my navy blue dress, a simple, well-tailored garment I had always saved for important events. It was the dress of a woman who knew her own mind. I paired it with my mother's small pearl earrings, not for sentimentality, but for strength. The real estate office was modern and minimalist, smelling of strong coffee and quiet efficiency. The agent, a young woman named Sarah, greeted me with a warm, professional smile. When she handed me the documents, my hand was steady. I read each clause, my old teacher's eyes missing nothing. Then I signed my name, the ink flowing smoothly, a dark, decisive stroke. "Congratulations, Mrs. Allen," Sarah said, handing me a small, unmarked envelope. "The keys." The new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a handsome brick building overlooking a small park. When I unlocked the door for the first time, I was greeted by the clean, sharp smell of fresh paint. The afternoon sun poured through the large windows, bathing the empty rooms in a bright, hopeful light. The floors were polished hardwood, reflecting the sky. From the living room, I could hear the distant, comforting murmur of the city, the gentle hum of traffic, the laughter of children in the park below. It wasn't the silence of isolation. It was the sound of life. I walked to the bay window and stood there for a long moment, simply breathing it all in. Then I opened my handbag, took out the small, worn brass compass that had belonged to my grandfather, and placed it on the wide windowsill. Its needle quivered for a second before settling, pointing north. It had found its true direction. So had I. The next few days were a blur of methodical work. I spent an afternoon in the garden, not tending to it, but preparing it for its new caretakers. I pruned the rose bushes one last time, my gloved hands moving with practiced care. I wasn't saying goodbye. I was ensuring a smooth transition. Each snip of the shears felt like severing a final, unnecessary tie. This garden, like the house, was a story. It was time for a new chapter, to be written by someone else. My own story required a different kind of soil now. The day before the movers were scheduled to arrive, Daniel came again. This time, he didn't knock. I heard him on the porch, his footsteps hesitant. I was in the living room, packing a box with my most cherished books. when his voice came through the mail slot, strained and thin. "Mom, please, just talk to me." I paused, my hand resting on the worn leather spine of a first edition Faulkner. I did not go to the door. "I'm listening, Daniel," I said, my voice carrying clearly into the hall. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking. "Leo told me he saw you. He said you're leaving. You can't just leave your home. It stopped being just my home when it became your inheritance in your mind," I replied calmly, wrapping the book in tissue paper. "That's not fair. I love this house. We all do. We were worried about you," he pleaded, the old, tired manipulation. "No, Daniel," I said, my voice devoid of anger, full of a quiet certainty. "You were not worried. You were inconvenienced. There's a difference." A long silence followed. I could picture him standing there, confused, his well-rehearsed script rendered useless. He had come for an emotional scene, a fight, or a tearful reconciliation. I was offering him only the quiet, indigestible truth. When he finally spoke again, his voice was small. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry for what I said." I closed my eyes. This was the apology I had once longed for. But it was too late. He was apologizing for the words, but he still didn't understand the silence that had preceded them for years. "I know you are," I said, and the sadness in my own voice surprised me. "Goodbye, Daniel." I heard his sharp intake of breath, then nothing but the sound of his footsteps retreating, slow and heavy, down the walkway. After he was gone, I sat down in my grandfather's rocking chair and finally allowed myself to cry. It was not a storm of grief, but a quiet, cleansing rain. For 7 minutes, tears streamed down my face, tears for the laughing boy in the doorframe, for the young man I had been so proud of, for the final, irrevocable loss of the son I thought I had. When the tears stopped, I felt a profound calm. The last ghost had been laid to rest. That evening, my friends Helen and Eleanor came over for one last tea in the old house. They brought a lemon cake, and their easy, uncomplicated warmth. The living room, dotted with packed boxes, felt full and alive with their presence. We didn't talk about the drama. Eleanor, a retired librarian, told a hilarious story about a patron who insisted that Shakespeare had plagiarized Hamlet from an obscure science fiction novel. Helen lamented a rogue squirrel that was stealing all her prize-winning tomatoes. The conversation was a comforting tapestry of the mundane, a reminder that life, in its best moments, is made of small, shared joys. "So," Helen said, pouring more tea, "it's all set for Saturday?" I nodded. "The movers come at 9. My new life begins at noon." They didn't offer pity or ask probing questions. They offered support. "We'll be here at 8 with coffee and donuts," Eleanor declared. "And I've already mapped out the best route to the new place to avoid traffic," Helen added, ever the pragmatist. Their friendship was a quiet, sturdy thing, a shelter I had built for myself without even realizing it. They were my new family, the one I had chosen. Kate arrived the next day. She didn't knock. She used her old key, the one I had forgotten to ask for back, and let herself in, her heels clicking with sharp authority on the hardwood floors. She found me in the study, labeling the box marked "The Work." She was dressed in a severe black pantsuit, her face a mask of cold fury. "I cannot believe you are actually going through with this," she began, her voice low and dangerous. "After everything Daniel has been through, you choose now to abandon your family." "I am not abandoning anyone, Kate," I replied, placing a final roll of tape on the box. "I am simply retiring from a role I was never formally offered, but was expected to play for life." "A role?" Being a mother? A grandmother? You're throwing it all away over one stupid comment at a dinner party. You are punishing your son because your feelings were hurt. I turned to face her, my expression calm. The dinner was not the cause, it was the clarification. It was the moment I understood that my memories were considered a social liability, that my life was considered boring. I let the word hang in the air between us. She scoffed. Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. This is about the house, isn't it? This is your way of controlling Daniel, even now. And then I finally gave her the truth she had never wanted to hear. You are mistaken. This was never about control. It was about worth. For years, I have been the family historian, the keeper of memories, the emotional center. But I was also seen as something else, an asset. This house, my savings, my stories, they were all part of a portfolio you were all waiting to inherit. The problem wasn't that Daniel asked me to be silent. The problem was that you all agreed with him. You wanted my function, but you no longer valued my person. Her face paled. For a moment, she was speechless. Then, the anger returned. You will regret this, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You will be a lonely, bitter old woman in a tiny apartment, and we will move on. You'll have nothing. I smiled, a genuine, pitying smile. On the contrary, Kate, a family that doesn't remember its past doesn't have a future. I've simply decided to gift our past to those who will cherish it. As for being lonely, I picked up a small, elegant business card from my desk. My life is fuller than it's been in years. I am a consultant now. I held the card out to her. Her eyes widened as she read the text. Nora Allen, oral historian and archival consultant, the County Historical Society. If you or Daniel have any further questions about the disposition of this property, I said, my voice soft but final, you can direct them to Miss Evans. She is now the steward of this family's legacy. He asked me to be silent. Instead, I decided to make my stories speak forever. She snatched the card from my hand as if it were on fire. Her carefully constructed composure shattered, revealing the raw, grasping panic beneath. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the house, her clicking heels a frantic, defeated retreat. The door closed behind her, a final period on a long, complicated sentence. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sadness. I felt only a profound and expansive quiet. But this time, it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of sovereignty. The final ties were severed not with a dramatic snap, but with the quiet click of a pen and the rustle of official paper. A week after I moved, a thick envelope arrived from Mr. Peterson's office. Inside, along with the finalized trust documents for the Historical Society, was a short, handwritten note from him. Dear Nora, it read, all matters are now concluded. The property has been formally transferred, and all financial instruments are solely under your name. You are now the sole architect of every inch of your life. It has been an honor to assist you. I folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of my new desk. The sole architect. The words resonated with a profound sense of peace. That afternoon, I walked to the local post office and closed the old P.O. box that had been in my family for 50 years, the one to which Daniel and Kate still had a key. The clerk handed me a single, small, silver key for my new box. It felt cool and light in my palm, a key not just to a mailbox, but to a life that was now entirely, irrefutably my own. Leo visited me on a Saturday, in the old house, one last time. We sat on the porch steps in the autumn sunshine, the air filled with the scent of fallen leaves. The house behind us was a quiet, empty shell, no longer mine, but not yet belonging to anyone else. It was a liminal space, perfect for this final conversation. We didn't talk about the move. Instead, we ate the last of the shortbread cookies from a simple tin. Dad Island. Quiet, Leo offered, not looking at me. He walks around the house like he's lost something. Mom says you're being selfish and vindictive. I watched a yellow leaf spiral down from the old maple tree. He isn't missing me, Leo. He's missing the version of me that existed to validate his own life. The mother who baked pies, hosted perfect dinners, and kept a silent, orderly house that he could be proud of. He's not grieving a person, he's grieving the loss of a service. Leo nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, framed sketch. It was a drawing he had made, a pen and ink depiction of my grandfather's rocking chair, but in his drawing, the chair wasn't old or rickety. It looked strong, almost like a throne, and sitting in it was the faint, powerful outline of a queen. "I made this for you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For your new place, so you remember, you know who you are." I took the drawing, my fingers tracing the strong, confident lines. "Oh, Leo," I whispered, my heart swelling with a love so pure it ached. "I will treasure this, always." The morning of the move was still and gray, the sky a soft, pearlescent canvas. My friends arrived at 8, as promised, with a large thermos of coffee and a box of warm donuts. We sat on the packed boxes in the echoing living room, our laughter a warm, bright sound against the emptiness. At 9, the movers came. I walked through the house one last time, my footsteps loud on the bare wood floors. I ran my hand along the doorframe in Daniel's old room, feeling the familiar notches. I stood in the kitchen and remembered the scent of 1,000 meals. There was no pain, only a quiet, profound gratitude for the life that had been lived there, for the lessons it had taught me. On the clean kitchen counter, I left the old house key and a simple note on a card. "Thank you for the shelter. May you hold many more stories." Then I walked out the front door and, without looking back, closed it gently behind me. My new apartment welcomed me with the smell of fresh paint and possibility. The building manager, a cheerful woman named Maria, greeted me in the lobby with a single potted orchid. "Welcome home, Mrs. Allen," she said with a genuine smile. "We're so happy to have you." The movers were efficient and respectful, their easy chatter filling the empty space with life. After they left, I stood alone amidst the boxes, the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. The silence was different here. It was a blank page, not an echo chamber. I opened the box labeled "The Work" first. I took out my diaries and placed them on the new bookshelf. Then, I unwrapped Leo's drawing and hung it on the wall opposite the window, where the light would catch it. The rocking chair throne looked magnificent. The last thing I unpacked from that box was my new digital recorder. I placed it on the desk, a silent promise of the work still to come. I made myself a cup of tea, using a new kettle that whistled a cheerful, modern tune, and sat on the floor, leaning against a box, watching the city lights begin to twinkle as dusk fell. A few weeks later, my new routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm. One morning, while unpacking a box of my husband's old books, a faded, folded piece of paper fell out from between the pages of his favorite poetry anthology. It was a note he had written to me years ago, after I'd won a local short story contest. "My dearest Nora," it read, "never let anyone tell you that your stories are small. They hold the entire world. Keep telling them. Your voice is the most beautiful thing I know." Tears welled in my eyes, not of sadness, but of affirmation. It was a blessing from the past, a confirmation that I was on the right path. That afternoon, I baked a loaf of simple, crusty bread, not for a family dinner, but for myself. The process was a meditation, the kneading of the dough, the warmth of the oven, the incredible aroma that filled my small, bright kitchen. It was an act of self-nourishment, simple and profound. Leo came to visit that afternoon. He brought his bicycle, which had a broken chain. We sat on my small balcony, surrounded by my pots of lavender and rosemary, and I showed him how to fix it, just as my father had once shown me. We worked in comfortable silence, our hands greasy, the city humming below us. "This is nice," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's peaceful." He looked out over the park, then back at me, a thoughtful expression on his young face. "Is this what peace is?" I smiled, spreading a thick layer of butter and homemade jam on a warm slice of bread for him. "Not all of it," I said, handing him the slice. "But it is a piece of it, a very important piece." That evening, after Leo had left, I sat by the window in my grandfather's rocking chair, which fit perfectly in the sunlit corner. I didn't miss the big house. I didn't miss Daniel's silence or Kate's brittle smiles. I didn't miss the old version of myself, the one who whispered, "Maybe next time they will see you," because now I saw myself, and I no longer needed anyone else's permission to exist. There is a point in the life of a silkworm when it stops consuming and begins to build. It seals itself within a shroud of its own making, not as a tomb, but as a crucible. Inside, in the suffocating darkness, a violent and miraculous alchemy takes place. The crawling, earthbound thing dissolves, its very essence liquefying into a primordial soup of pure potential. And then, from that chaos, something new begins to form, stronger, lighter, utterly transformed. It emerges not by breaking its prison, but by patiently dissolving it from within, stepping out into the light not as what it was, but as what it was always meant to become, a creature with wings, built for the sky. My old life was my cocoon. I did not shatter it in a fit of rage. I simply outgrew it, dissolving the threads of obligation and expectation with the quiet acid of self-worth until I could finally step into the sun, whole and entirely my own. The final act of this transformation was not emotional, it was transactional. A quiet closing of the books. Mr. Peterson called on a crisp November morning to inform me that the sale of the house had been finalized. The funds, he explained, had been transferred to the newly established endowment fund for the County Historical Society. I listened, my heart calm and steady. There was no pang of loss, no nostalgic ache. I had already grieved for the house and the life within it. This was no longer an ending. It was an accounting. "Thank you, Robert," I said, "for everything." That afternoon, I walked to the Historical Society, not as a petitioner, but as a benefactor. Elena, the young archivist, met me in the lobby, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She led me to the director's office, a cozy room filled with the comforting scent of old paper and beeswax. I handed the director the final documents. He looked at me, clearly moved. "Mrs. Allen," he said, his voice husky, "this is an extraordinary gift. It will ensure that the stories of this county are preserved for generations." What a legacy. I smiled, a small, private smile. "The stories are for everyone," I said, my voice clear and sure. "But the legacy, that is for the women who are told their lives are boring." My new apartment had become a sanctuary, not just for me, but for Leo. He started visiting every Saturday, a quiet ritual we both cherished. One afternoon, he arrived carrying a small, sturdy cardboard box. "Can I keep this here?" he asked, his gaze averted. "It's my stuff, my drawings, My journal. Things I don't want them to find. I understood immediately. It was a lockbox for his soul, a place to store the parts of himself that couldn't survive in the sterile, judgmental atmosphere of his own home. I cleared a space for it on the top shelf of my closet. Of course, I said gently, it will be safe here. As we sat drinking tea later, he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. Do you think they'll ever change, Grandma? I considered this, stirring my tea, the clink of the spoon against porcelain the only sound. That's the wrong question, my love. I finally answered, my voice soft but firm with a sad wisdom. The real question is, will they ever stop pretending? He looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his young eyes. He was learning the difference between appearance and truth, a lesson that would serve him well. When he left, the bond between us felt stronger than ever, a quiet alliance forged not in shared blood, but in shared truth. A week later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was Daniel's tense, spiky, the letters leaning backward, as if trying to retreat from the page. I opened it with a strange lack of emotion, a detached curiosity. It was short, a jumble of remorse and confusion. Mom, I don't understand what happened. The house is gone. Everything is gone. I drive past it sometimes and there are other people there. I am so sorry. I miss you. I read the words twice. The apology was there, raw and desperate. The pain was real, but it was the pain of a man who had lost a landmark, not a mother. He missed the version of me that had anchored his world. I slowly folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, alongside my husband's old note. I didn't tear it up. I didn't answer it. I simply gave it a place to rest, a quiet acknowledgement of its existence, without allowing it to cast a shadow on my present. My 80th birthday arrived not with a fanfare of forced celebration, but with the quiet grace of a sunrise. I woke early and made myself pancakes, just for one, arranging them on my favorite plate with a fan of fresh strawberries. I sat by the window, sipping coffee, watching the city awaken. There were no dutiful phone calls to anticipate, no hollow congratulations to endure. There was only the simple, profound pleasure of my own company. At noon, Leo arrived. He didn't bring a store-bought gift, but a small, hand-bound book. On the cover, in his neat, careful script, were the words, The Stories of Nora Allen, Volume 2. Inside, he had written down all the stories I had told him during our Saturday visits. He had illustrated them with his own beautiful, intricate drawings. Volume 1 is what you lived, he said, his smile shy but proud. This is what you're living now. We spent the afternoon talking, not about the past, but about his future, his plans for college, his passion for art. He looked at me across the table, his expression serious. You look different, Grandma, he said. Happier. Like a person who doesn't flinch anymore. In the evenings, I would sit in my grandfather's rocking chair, a soft blanket over my knees. My fiddle-leaf fig, which had nearly died from neglect in the old house, now stood tall by the window, its glossy new leaves unfurling toward the light. On Fridays, Helen and Eleanor would come for dinner. We would eat simple soup and crusty bread, drink wine, and fill the small apartment with easy, genuine laughter. Sometimes, a text message would appear on my phone. Happy birthday, Mom. I would read it, and then set the phone down, the message unanswered, not out of anger, but out of a calm, settled peace. The conversation was over. That night, on my 80th birthday, I opened my diary to a fresh page. The last volume of my old life was full, archived and complete. This was the first entry of a new one. I thought back to that awful dinner, to the careless words that had fractured my world only to set me free. They had silenced my stories, believing my life was over. They couldn't have been more wrong. I picked up my pen, and the words came, clear and final. They wanted to know why I bothered to keep living. Now, I have the answer. I live to remember my own name. I live to set my own table. And I live to keep the door unlocked for those who have learned to knock with gentle hands.